Hello everybody and welcome back to our ASP.NET Core for Absolute Beginners course, which is a live stream, live coding sessions that we'll do each Monday. And we'll start, this is lesson 3. And you have in the description of this video the repository where you can find the source code for all the lessons. And you should look under branches, because for each lesson we have a branch. So this is lesson 3 right now. If you didn't watch, for instance, lesson 2, then you can go on that repository, and if you go under branches, you will see a branch which is called lesson 2, and under that branch you see the code exactly how we finished during the last live stream. And today, after this one, I will push a new branch which will be called lesson 3. So okay, thank you for confirming that you can hear me. That's actually great. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so first of all, sorry that I'm kind of a little bit late, but I was traveling a lot and didn't even manage to set up my green screen behind, so this is why you don't see a dark background, but you see my real background here. So yeah, but we'll get started soon enough. Let me also, before we start off again, probably I'll also need the whiteboard, so I'll bring it up on the other screen. I guess it's on this one right now, but I'll move it on the other for now. And I'll create a new whiteboard. We'll probably use this, so yeah. But until it's loading, let's get started by having a short summary on where we actually left the last time. So is the whiteboard is here. Let me go here under settings, and I want to have the dark background for this one. Cool. I have to choose here the color for the pen. That should be okay right now. Cool. Okay, so let's start over once again to check if everything's okay. I guess you can hear me, you can still see me. Okay, so the last time what we did is we modeled our domain. So we have here created a hotel entity with some very basic properties. For now, we'll see that we will actually get more into this while we do this course, and we'll probably reshape a lot of these properties. When we go to the part where we will integrate with a SQL database using Entity Framework Core, then we will also probably have to do some refactoring here in order to be compliant to the Entity Framework Core conventions, but we will talk about that a lot. Probably there will be 2 or 3 lessons only on Entity Framework Core. But for now, I guess it's okay to help us get started. Then we have this concept of reservation, which we have also modeled in our domain very briefly, with a room, with a start date, end date, and a customer. For the customer right now, we just have a string, but we'll probably take this out in a dedicated class at a certain point. And we have this concept of room, which is a very basic model of a room, which has a room number, a surface, and needs repair property. This is what we'll probably use when we try to do a reservation, to not accept a reservation for a room that needs repair. But we'll see exactly what more properties we will need as we will work on our API. And after that, we have already implemented the first controller, this hotels controller, and we have briefly discussed at that point that in order for our class, because we have created a new class from scratch, and in order to make it a controller, there were actually 2 things that we need to do. The first one, we actually need to inherit from controller. Now, you probably will see other tutorials or trainings where they say you should inherit from API controller, like it would be something like that. And probably that's then in another namespace, so we can just or no, sorry, API controller is as an attribute, but they would say to inherit from controller base. Now, what I would like to do is to inherit from controller. And here in this kind of level that we are like for beginners, I don't really want to go very deep into the reasons why I like or why I prefer controller, but to have a very brief summary is that the controller base, as the name implies with base, offers you some very basic functionality of a controller that you might need in an API. But if you use controller, then this would also have support for returning views. And that would gives us a lot more flexibility. We won't return views of course here in our API, because in an API we need to return JSON or XML, and we will return JSON, which is nowadays the default, I would say. So everybody is using JSON. And yeah, that's why we inherit from controller, and that's how our class actually becomes a controller. And if you don't know exactly what a controller is, then please go back to lesson 1, where we have discussed in depth about what a controller is, what the responsibilities of a controller are, and things similar to that. But then there are other important things that we needed to do. First of all, we need to say this is an API controller, and this attribute kind of like help us to do some out of the box model binding and model validation, and we'll talk about it in further lessons. But that's why we need this this attribute. Our API could also work without this one, but this one will make it easier for us to work with a controller that is a controller designed for an API. I hope this is clear till now. And then this is actually the second very important part. So the first very important part is we have to inherit from controller or controller base. And the second is here we have to specify a route. And this type of convention of placing this word controller in brackets, this is actually very important. And in order to show you why this is important, let's run the application, because we already have built in Swagger. It comes by default with the web API template in ASP.NET Core, so we didn't have to do anything for that. But let me bring this here on this screen, and let us just wait a little bit until everything loads. So, and I guess if we look at this side by side, it's actually easier to understand why actually we need to describe here this route and place this word controller in square brackets. And the reason is very simple. You see that where we see our endpoints, we see that we have here hotels, and we have here this method get on the hotels endpoint. So this is actually the URL. And if we look at our controller, we see that it actually contains hotels and then the word controller. Now, of course, what this route does and this controller in square brackets is that, that it says, okay, when you create the endpoints and the URLs, then just use the first part of this class name, so hotels, and skip controller. And that's why our URL will be hotels instead of hotels controller. So this is very important. And one other thing that we could do here is, which is kind of like how usually API routes are defined, is that we put everything under an API base part of the URL. So if we run the application again, we will see that right now our URL will be, let's make it a little bit bigger. So right now we see that our URL is API hotels. So the API is exactly what we have written. And then for the second part is exactly what we said before. So we just instruct here ASP.NET Core, when it does construct these URLs, to just leave this controller part outside the URL and just take the name part, these hotels. And that's why our URL is right now API/hotels, which is very nice. So this is why we actually need here this convention, like this placeholder with the word controller in square brackets. That's very important, and that's why we actually need it. And then that's actually it. We just have here one method, we said that in an ASP.NET Core controller, we usually return an iAction result that could be different type of responses. In our case, we just return an OK and a string. So if we run this API endpoint right now, let's execute, we see that we get this hello from hotels controller. So exactly what we have written here. So this is actually a very basic proof of concept that our controller right now actually works. And that's kind of fine. Now, can you please let me know if everything's okay regarding this whole concept of controllers and how we make in ASP.NET Core a class to be considered a real controller? If you have questions, then please don't hesitate and ask them in the chat. That would be very, very important for me, because it's really important to also have an overview, like if there are some topics that we would actually need to go into more depth. So just let me know. Okay, I see a yep, and I would assume that this means that for now everything is clear. Good. Now let's go one step further right now in our controller, and what I want to do is implement a full CRUD controller in ASP.NET Core. So this means that we would have to implement methods. Let's maybe just discuss once again what CRUD means. So CRUD, this stays for create, read, update, and delete. So this is the acronym CRUD, and usually all controllers have at least this type of behavior, like create, read, update, and delete. With one thing to say is that for read, we usually have something like get all, where we get a list or we get a list of that specific entity. Of course, right now for the beginning, we will just have a get all, but usually in a real API, and we look into this when we are a little bit more advanced, you usually have some filtering criteria that you would use when you want to retrieve a list. Because you can assume when the application grows, you would have at some point maybe thousands of such resources, and you don't want to really retrieve them from the database in one go. So you kind of need some filtering criteria to decide exactly, okay, I want a list of this certain resource, in our case hotels, but that fulfills a certain criteria. And that would be the get all part. And then it would be, we will also have a get by ID, which is also very important because the get by ID is used by the consumer applications. Usually APIs are consumed by a single page application, which could be Angular, could be React, could be Vue, could be even be Blazor, for instance. And this means that for sure our application, or the application that will consume our APIs, will also need a way to actually just display information about one single entity or one single resource. So that's why we need to provide also an endpoint for get by ID. Now let's try to implement all of this here in our controller. Now, the name of the methods that we specify here is actually not important. That's something that we can use in order to better understand logically what we exactly want to achieve with a certain controller action. And by the way, when we talk about controllers, methods are usually called actions, because this method is actually a controller action. So it is an action that will get executed when an HTTP GET request will come in for this specific route, which in this case is the base route, which is the API/hotels. And this is how this text was actually then retrieved. This is how ASP.NET Core actually finds the routes and then executes the actions that are available for that specific route. So I guess that that's fairly straightforward. So right now, let's then implement this whole idea with get all, get by ID, and create, update, and delete. Good. Now let's, in order to do this, what we would need to create is, I would like to have a list of resources, like a list of hotels that we can reuse maybe here in this controller. So let's create here a private method, private, that would return a list of hotel, because this is actually the resource with which we are working right now. Of course, we will need to add this using, oh, I had to add this reference to the domain. Okay, let's add the reference to that. Okay, so right now everything's okay. So I would have this private method that returns a list of hotels, and it would be get hotels. And this one will, that's actually just a very dummy data source, let's say, that we will use for now until we will get to work with a database. Now here I would have let's say here var hotels, or actually we can just return new list of hotel. And what we'll do here, we'll use a collection initializer, and here we'll create two hotels. So we have first new hotel, and we'll also use an object initializer in this case, and probably we'll just have also another new hotel, and we'll also use this object initializer. Now let's here populate. We have a hotel ID, hotel name, stars address, and until we get there, please write in the chat a hotel name that you would like to see in this API. I really haven't thought about this, so please write in the chat a name of a hotel that you actually want to see in our booking API. That would be very much appreciated. So let's start with hotel ID, and that would be 1. What was the second name? Okay, we already need the name, and I don't see any hotel in the chat for now. So Trivago, but Trivago is an app, is not a hotel. What we kind of do is actually create an API for Trivago. So we really need a name for a hotel in your area. Just give me a name of a hotel in your hometown. And that would be great. Let's say here stars. So let's say it's 3. Okay. What other properties do we have here? Address, city, country. Conquistador. Okay, and in which country is this? That should be a string. Okay. Let's assume it has 3 stars. In which country is this? Country and city. That would be also something that we need. Country. So just let me know the country and city. We would need to specify that here. Okay, let's in the meantime look what other things we would have here. List of room. For now we don't care about rooms, we just in Puerto Rico. Okay, nice, Puerto Rico. Cool, we'll use that. And description, will say a very dummy description. Okay, so country is we still need also a second hotel. So anybody else, please provide another hotel. Thank you very much, Gabriel, for your help here. It's highly appreciated. So right now we have this city, we have this country. Let's say it's 3 stars, maybe it's more, I don't really know. But once again, that's really not important. And for a description, let's just choose a description. Cool, so we have that here. Still waiting for a second hotel, because we are already there, we just need it. Okay. So this would have the ID 2. Still waiting for a new hotel. That would be very, very nice. Okay, since nobody entered anything here, let's use a hotel where I stayed in Seattle. I guess that was 4 stars, and it was in country USA and city Seattle. Some nice description. Okay, so now we have this very, very basic list of hotels. Now here, what we should do here, in this case, this would be the method for get all. I don't know why I named this get rooms. Now let's just call it get all hotels. And in this case, well, it's very easy. We can say, we can provide this directly into the OK method. But what I want to do is here to make it very explicit what we do. So var hotels equals get all hotels, which will be now the problem is it's get hotels, the private method. Good, okay. And then we can just return the hotels here. Cool. So this would be then the get all one. So let's run this once again. It started on the other screen. So okay, so right now we have this get API hotels, and if we try it out, we see that right now we received a list of hotels, which are these hotels that we provided right now. So that's kind of cool, because right now we have a real API endpoint that returns some real data in JSON format, just like the way that an API should do. So we are good to go with the get all part. So this is the first method that corresponds to the read part in the CRUD. Now, and here actually things will become a little bit more interesting. And we have to be careful here, because we want to adhere to the REST principles. And once again, if you don't know exactly what those REST principles are, maybe after this one, go to the first lesson of this series, because there we have fully discussed towards the end of the lesson what REST actually means and what those principles are. Now, here we want, as said, for the second get, we want to get one by ID. And here comes the more interesting part, because the get all is very, very easy. Now, let's first create the method. We will have private I action result. All controller methods in our case will return this I action result. And for instance, what we could do here, we can get a hotel by ID. And that would be our method. Okay. Now, as we did previously, we have to decorate right now our method with some attributes that would actually help us to understand exactly what this method or what this action is actually designed for. And I see here somebody saying that that he or she can see. Can anybody else confirm if you can see me and hear me? Because my data shows that the stream should be okay. The health of the stream is okay. So please just let me know if you can see me and hear me okay. And of course, if you can see the screen. That would be very, very important. Now in the meantime, let's go back here to this idea. So first of all, okay, Adelina is saying that it is okay. Thank you very much. Good. So first of all, we have then also to say, because for this one, we also want to respond on a get. And we'll see that when we, okay, everything is good here. Warren, thank you very much for confirming. So going back, we have to decorate and say that we want to execute this method once we have an HTTP GET. Now, okay, so you have problem with code. Okay, well, that's unfortunate. Because I guess if you see me, you should also see my Visual Studio. Okay, good. So, but right now we have a problem. And here, for instance, let's just do the following thing, because I like to first show you what problems we would have and then how we can resolve them, because this would actually explain why we do certain things when we define our controller actions. So let's say var hotel, and for instance, right now, let's say this is hotels equals get hotels. So we get all the hotels, and then let's say var hotel, and for now let's say is hotels dot where, or actually we can use first or default, and we want to look for a hotel for which the ID equals 1. And this is a very regular lambda expression. It's first or default. This is a method that we have on lists and on collections in general. And it allows us to specify some criteria based on which we actually want to search something in a certain collection. And here we say that in this collection hotels, I would like to search for a hotel for which the ID equals 1. So that's basically what I'm doing here. Nothing more fancy than that. And then what we could do is here return okay, and let's here, and we'll return in this case as the body. Usually what we put here in parentheses is the body of the response, and we just return here this hotel. And now let's be very, very careful about what happens, for instance, if we run this application now. So it has started. It's actually loading. And here, for instance, you see that we actually have only one method here. So we don't have two methods. We have only one method that returns the list that we had previously. So we have created this endpoint, but what it happened actually is that we don't see it in Swagger. And if we would use Postman instead to make a request, what it would happen is that it wouldn't know exactly where to actually so it wouldn't know exactly how to actually distinguish on when it should execute this action and when it should execute this action, because we say that for both we listen for an HTTP GET and we don't specify anything else. And this means that both of these actions will actually or should theoretically be mapped to the same URL. Now we can't do that, because for one certain URL we can only have one certain action that would actually take care of fulfilling a request that comes for that specific URL. And that's why, since we also need to provide an ID here, we have to further specify the route. And here is the point where we also have to stick to the REST principles. So we can use once again the route attribute. So it's exactly the same attribute that we have used previously to define here this controller placeholder that would use only the hotels part of our class name and not the controller. So it's exactly the same route that would allow us, since we have placed this route here, it would allow us to provide some further information to the route. Like for instance, if we want to have a route to which we could add afterwards something like ID or 3, which would represent the ID. Now we can't do that here because that would apply to the entire controller. But since we already have the base route here on the controller class, here on the route we can just specify only what follows after this base part. So in this case, what we would need to provide here is just an ID. However, here is the interesting part, because the ID could be something very, very dynamic. At some points, clients might use 1 for ID, at some other points 2, at some other points 3, at some other points maybe 110, and so on and so forth. And we can't know exactly which ID the clients will ask for. So we can't really hard code that. So what we can do instead, and here ASP.NET Core is also very, very helpful to us, is that we can provide here placeholders. And for these placeholders, we place them in curly braces. So when we place them here in curly braces, then ASP.NET Core, if we already run this application again, let's try to do this. Okay, and we see that unfortunately we still don't have this this other get method for the ID, which is very, very strange. So I'm not exactly sure what happens here with this one. So let us check again. Okay, let's maybe fully qualify everything that we need. So why we need this placeholder is because we can say here then, here as an incoming param to our action, we want an ID, which is of type int. And in that case, what ASP.NET Core would do is that it would actually take the ID that the client uses, and it would place it here in my action. And therefore, I can reuse it. And instead of saying here that I want to filter for hotels that have the ID 1, we can see here that we want to filter for hotels that have the ID, which is the value which we get here. So once again, the way that this should work is that the clients would specify an ID when they make the request. We have here a placeholder. So when a request comes in for this route, what it will happen is that ASP.NET Core will say, okay, the URL part after hotels, here should be a placeholder for ID. So it would take everything. That is actually in that part, and it will cast it to an ID or to an int, and it will give us that value to us. So in this case, we can take that value and actually use it to do our filter in the list and then return everything. Then there is added to the iAction result. Yes, we have added to this method that actually returns an iAction result. And yeah, actually, let's maybe place this route above the HTTP GET. It would be also maybe more useful. And let's actually try to run this again. We have this get all hotels and this one. It's private. Oh my god, why didn't you tell me this? So that was the whole problem with this one. Yes, the ID is the parameter for the user. And let's actually put a breakpoint here. So let's put a breakpoint here and let's run the application once again. In that case, well, we didn't see the endpoint because it was marked as private. So of course, nobody knew about that. But right now we should be able to see it. And you see also in Swagger, actually it's very, very nice because we see that the URL for this endpoint is /API/hotels, so like the other one. But then we have this ID, which is actually the placeholder. And you see that it is also required and Swagger knows about that. So we can simply click here on try it out. And then we need to specify here an ID because this is required. So let's execute this, and we'll see that we actually entered this breakpoint, and we see that right now our ID here has the value 1 because in the URL we have here the value 1. We have provided 1 as the value for this ID. So in this case, when we step over, we search for an hotel that actually has this ID, and we found one. So we found this one. So we just return this result. And if we look here, we see that we have only one hotel, which is great because this is the only hotel that we actually looked for. Now, if we want to try it again, we can just simply change here this to 2. And in this case, once again, we execute it. When we step over it, we see that our ID is right now 2. So ASP.NET Core took that 2 from the URL and mapped it here as an ID, as an incoming parameter to our method. And then we can use it, of course, for this filtering. Then we have also the result, which is the second hotel. And if we click on continue, we get the new result for that. See that it's the total new result. And we could, for instance, let's see what happens if we put here 10. Once again, this executes. Here, this ID is right now 10. So it's dynamically mapped. Once again, just to remember, when you want ASP.NET Core to map some params from the URL, you just have to place them in curly braces and make sure that the name of the parameter corresponds to the name that you have specified here in the URL. And ASP.NET Core will do the rest for you. So you don't have to think about anything else. So right now we have this ID 10. Now, of course, we go here and try to do this filtering based on ID 10. But in this case, our hotel is null because we don't have a hotel with the hotel ID 10. In this case, we just returned null. So if we click on continue, everything's okay, only that here the result, well, is actually nothing. So I don't really have a result. It's null. I don't have anything here. And this would actually be a little bit misleading. Here we get actually a 204. But the idea is that we have here this scenario where somebody could provide an ID in the URL that is actually not present in our data source. So we don't find a resource with this type of, or with this value for the ID. But before we go further to solve this problem, I just want to show you one other thing, which is very, very important to know. Because let's bring this once again to this other window. This is once again a scenario that you might have very, very often. So here we are on this one, we say try it out, and we have to specify an ID. But instead of specifying a number, I specified here a string, and let's execute. And here it says that, okay, we need this to be an integer. And this is actually because Swagger actually looks into the fact that we want an ID here. So it actually won't allow us to have here an ID. But if we would try to do this with Postman, for example, or other tools, you could instead, for instance, specify here a string instead of a number. Now the thing is that in that case, this ID would have default value. And since ID is an integer, it would have a default value of 0. So every time that you specify in the route a parameter that is actually impossible to map in our case to an integer, ASP.NET Core will just put there a default value. And for integers, the default value is 0. If we would have here something like a string, for instance, and we provide something that cannot be mapped to a string, which is virtually impossible, but purely theoretically, or in pure theory, it would be null because the default value for classes is null. So this is one other thing that you have to pay attention. If somebody provides here something that cannot be mapped to the data type that we expect here, you will always get the default value. So that's something that we would have to take into consideration. Now I see that there is a question maybe so far. Passing the parameter, you can use route without having to configure it. Where you set up your endpoints in startup.cs, you don't have to do that. That's the very cool thing about APIs, or theoretically, when you create a new API, a new web API project, but that's actually done also, for instance, for regular ASP.NET Core applications, is here in this final middleware. And we'll talk about middleware probably next Monday. The idea is in this method, endpoints map controllers. What this does, it actually scans uh, our project for all classes that are marked with or that inherit this controller or controller base. And this is how ASP.NET Core can actually, when you start up the application, it already creates a map of all your routes in the applications. But you actually don't have to do anything about that in an API. You just have it here and you can use it. So it's something that you don't really need to care about. If you want to override the default ways that ASP.NET Core creates these route maps, then you can certainly do that. But that's certainly not something to discuss during this course for beginners. That's clearly some more advanced topics about what endpoint routing is, how does it work, how can we override the default conventions that we have in ASP.NET Core. But otherwise, or also in most web APIs or production-ready APIs that I have worked on, we never had to actually override this standard behavior. So what you actually have here in startup with map controllers is actually enough. You just have to decorate your actions with attributes that would describe exactly what route that is and what parameters it has, and everything is done then under the hood. So we don't really have to take care about that. So Gabriel, this does this answer your question? That would be my question to you. Okay, so going then back, remember we had right now this scenario where we provided here the ID 10, and of course we didn't have here a hotel with ID 10. And in this case, we just returned null, and Swagger just, well, returned something that indicates that the call was successful, but still we didn't have anything. Now, this is a very clear scenario where we would have to implement some very basic if-else logic. And this is actually according to the REST principles. So whenever you get a request for a resource that is identifiable by an ID or by a certain or by one single property, then in your responses, you either should return that object, or if you don't find it, you should return not found, because the client needs to know that you actually didn't find that specific object. So in this case, we can do very basic stuff here, and we say here if hotel equals null. In this case, we don't return an OK, we return a not found. And this is why we return an IAction result, because under IAction result we can return OK, we can return not found, we can return created, we can return a bunch of different other stuff that actually returns something that implements the IAction result interface. And if we look at the IAction result interface, is nothing else than well, here it's an async thing that it executes something and returns a task. But these OK methods, these not found methods, everything here implements this IAction result. So as we say that we return an IAction result, we can return what we need to return. In this case, we just need to return a not found. And of course, if this is not null, then we won't enter into this if statement, so it won't be executed. So in that case, we will just return the regular hotel. This is a very first important REST principle. When you have an endpoint that kind of like returns something by an ID or by an identifier, could be any property, then in your response you should either return the object or you should return a not found. So let's run the application once again, and we will have a brief look into how this will actually look like in Swagger. So let's open that up. So we have here once again this API hotels / ID. We want to try it out, and let's provide an ID that we know it doesn't exist. So we provide 3. And once again, we get here into this one. So we get all the hotels, and then we try to do the filtering here. And we have null. And in this case, we will just return a not found, which is actually what we want. So let's do this. And in this case, we see that, okay, we have a response and we have a 404 error. And here there is also a response body that that actually ASP.NET Core generated for us. So we didn't have to take care about that. And it just specifies that it is a 404 not found. And the important thing here is this code. Because once again, if you are not sure about the different categories that we have of response status codes, they are actually very, very important because they kind of indicate, for instance, for those in ranges 400 and 500, they indicate, the codes indicate if the problem was due to something that the client provided, well, in a bad format, let's say, and errors 500 would then be returned if something happened on the server. So in this case, with not found, we return a 404, which means that the client, you, the client, in this case Swagger, you did something wrong. And in this case, of course, you did something wrong because you wanted to get a resource that does not exist. So somewhere in your application, you might have, I don't know, calculated that ID in a wrong way, and we don't actually have an object that has this ID. So the problem is somewhere on your side. Please provide in another call another ID that we might have, but this one clearly we don't have in our data source. So this is clearly an error for the client, and of course the client can then react based on this fact that it knows that the resource was not found. So that's why it's important. This not found will always return this 404, which is nice, and okay will always return 200. So we don't have really to take care about status codes here because this action results will already return the correct responses. Cool. So we have implemented here this idea of get by ID. And we have looked into some very, very important things like how we can actually define dynamic values in our route and then use them to actually get those values into our action method as incoming parameter. So yeah, cool. We are done here with this second part of the CRUD. Sorry, of the read part. So let's go in this create now. Okay. So let's go here in this create, and we need to implement a new method for that. So let us here have public I action result, and in this case we'll create hotel. And here for this create, when we want to create resources, there are also some very, very important and nice features and things that we would have to be careful about. So first of all, when we want to create a resource, we don't use an HTTP GET. So we would have to expose here an endpoint for HTTP post, because when we want, or when clients want to create resources, they need to use an HTTP post request. So first of all, we can say here HTTP post, so that ASP.NET Core should know that this is a request, or this action should actually handle a post request. Now the other question is, on which URL should be this post? And actually the response here is very, very simple, because when you create a resource, you actually don't know the ID of that resource. The ID will normally be generated by the API when you write it in the database. So you don't know the ID. You just know that you want it as a client to actually create something. In this case, create a new hotel. Now, the cool thing is that in this case, we can use also here this base route that we already have. So API hotels. So when we have a post request to API hotels, this action will be executed. But when we will have an HTTP GET request for the same one, this action will be executed. So you see that here, basically based on this add notation that we did here with GET and here with POST, ASP.NET Core would know exactly which action to choose depending on the HTTP method of the request. Okay, but then the next thing that we would have to actually take into discussion, right? When you want to post something, to create something, the client would also need to provide us with some information. They should provide us with information about the object that they want to create. In our case, they should actually provide us with information for the properties of the hotel that we have there. So that's kind of nice. But how do we actually get that information? Because that would be usually in a body, which will also be in JSON format. So how do we actually get it here in our method? And once again, ASP.NET Core is very, very helpful and friendly with this, because we can automatically map what we have an information from our body. And that's actually very, very easy, because we can here use this from body in square brackets, and we say that from body we want to map a hotel to a type hotel, and we will actually get it here. So what we would do in our case is, first of all, var hotels equals new used get before. Okay, Lina, I'm not sure exactly what you mean with used get before. So we have here hotels. Let's get the list of hotels in our case. And what we actually want to do, we have here in this body, we already have the hotel. So we can just say hotels.add in our case, and we'll just add the hotel there. Now, that's kind of cool. Everything should be okay. What's the problem with this? Missing. Okay. Yeah, we'll see. Just sorry, it's not get all hotels, but get hotels. Get all hotels is the controller action. So in this case, we can just add the hotel to it. And here, to be compliant to the REST principles, what we need to return is return created. And we usually also, well, something created. Okay, we have to specify here some things, and we can just return back. But we can here, of course, we have to specify a URL to which we can get the resource, but we can also use here created add action. How was it? Created add action. It should be. Okay, created add action, and in this case we have we need to specify the action where we would actually be able to get that resource. And in this case we can just use the name, and we can use name of and the action is get hotel by ID. So this would be the name of the action where you could retrieve the resource that was created. And here we can just specify an object value. But here we need also to specify the ID for the placeholder here. So in this case, we can just specify here a new we need a new object array. let's see. And let's say that ID, and we specify hotel dot hotel ID. Okay, and I guess we can already run this. So let's put a breakpoint, or let's just run the application. Okay, so right now we see that we have this post option, and here in this post, the try it out. Okay, here, well, since we say that we want a hotel, we could theoretically specify also the rooms, but right now this really doesn't interest us, so we don't really care about that. So we can try it out, and if you click on try it out here, the cool thing is that you already have here the JSON. And here you could specify, for instance, for now, we will also specify an ID. And here, my new hotel. So some dummy information here, for instance, let's specify also 3, address, whatever, city. Let's call it a city, and here a country. Cool. We don't want to use the rooms property, so we can just delete it. Okay. And then for the description, let's still put a breakpoint here, because we will have a certain problem here. Just let us open that, and let's execute this right now. So we see that we hit our breakpoint, and as we have decorated this with from body, if we see that ASP.NET Core mapped the JSON that came in with the body of the request, it mapped it to a hotel entity, and for all the properties that it had a value, we see that we actually have this value. And of course, for the rooms we have null, because we didn't specify here a list of rooms. So this list of room is null. So that's kind of cool. Right now, what we'll do, we get the hotels. We see that that we have 2 hotels in the list. If we go one more other step, we see that right now we have 3. And if we look into this one, we see that we have added our nice new hotel here in our list. And then we just return this created at action, and let us see exactly what that actually. Okay, this actually returned an exception. No routes matched the supplied values. Okay, so it means that that we did something wrong here in this method. So in this created at action, let's actually look into the definition of this one, and we have here once again the action name, and we have here, we actually need this one, action name, object route values, and then we also need the values. Okay, so let's try it this way. Let's provide also a third parameter, because we want to use a different overload. So we have get hotel by ID. For that one, we need to specify an anonymous object, and in that one we should specify an ID property, and we actually do that. Maybe, yeah, let's make it small letters to be exactly the same, and let's try to do this again. So let's run the application again. Okay, post, try it out. What we could do is we can even leave here the default values that we have, and just execute to make sure that everything's okay. And in that case, you see that in that case everything worked. And here we see that created action actually returned a 201 created. So this is the standard status code that we should return when we have successfully created a resource. But one other thing that I would like to show you, which is important for this created at action method, is this location header. Because this location is actually constructed based on what we have specified here. The name of the route, which would have been API hotels. Then the second parameter would be the routing values. So the routing value for this ID. And since we created everything with default values, it was 0. And then we also returned in this created action the object itself, which is in the body. But actually these first two parts of this method, or of the parameters of this method, actually define this location header. And that's standard REST principle, because clients, when they create something, they should get in the header the information on the exact URL that they could use actually to get the freshly created resource. So that's why we have used this created at action, so that we can return this 201 created and then specify the exact route on which that specific created resource can be retrieved, which in our case is this get by ID. So that's all the tricks of this HTTP post action with which we actually create a hotel. And let's actually run this once again, because I want to show you one problem that we have right now, and then we will try to solve after we implement all the CRUDs here, because we have a problem. So actually what happens is that, for instance, API hotels, let's create once again a post, try it out, and we'll use once again the default values here so that we can just execute it. So we see that everything was mapped. So everything is string as a value, and everything has default values, which is kind of cool. Now we get the hotels, and now we actually add our new hotel to the list, and we see that we have 3, which is okay. It's exactly what we would expect. That's great, I would say. Okay, so let's go one step further, but let's also place a breakpoint on here, this get hotel by ID. So let's continue. So we return the answer, everything's okay, 201 created, and here's the location header. Now we can just go over to this other method that gets a hotel by ID, and we should try it out, and we know that we just have created a hotel with 0. So we execute it. Now the problem is, when we get the hotels right now, we still have only 2 of them. That's because for each request, we actually get a brand new list of hotels. So even if we here in this create hotel, we have added a new hotel, when we made a new request, we got actually this list from scratch. And that's actually a very, very important part, because once again, according to the REST principles, each request should be totally isolated, or on all the other requests. So this means that each request we actually get a new list of hotels. So the problem is here that, of course, as we work with a very, very basic in-memory kind of setup for this list, for each request that we do, we actually get a brand new list. So this is why we can see that this list really grows. And we'll tackle this problem today, but just a little bit later, after we implement all the other endpoints to have a full CRUD controller here for hotels. So we have here an error because I accidentally typed something here. So right now we should be once again good to go. Good. Here, please make a video on SOAP-based API core. Sorry for that, but we won't really go into SOAP requests at all, because SOAP is a very old technology. almost nobody uses it anymore, and surely the audience for that that would be very, very thin, I guess. So sorry for that, but we won't go into SOAP, which is a totally different principle of getting data. That's actually a server to server communication. It's not a real API. So SOAP is a totally different framework. You can't even do it with ASP.NET Core. So yeah. Good. Let's just stop this application, and we have implemented the create. We have implemented the reads. Now we can also implement the updates. So right now we would have here a public I action result. It would be a update hotel. And here for the update hotel, what we actually need is actually to think about a few different aspects. So when we want to update a certain hotel, we know exactly what hotel we want to update. So, or let's start even better. Updates are always done via an HTTP put request. So this is why this action will be HTTP. Sorry for the typos here, HTTP. So this means that this action will be executed only on HTTP put requests. But then, as said, when we want to update a certain entity, we also know exactly what entity we want to update, and we can update only one resource at a time. So we have to identify that resource. So similarly to what we have here with get by ID, we will also have to specify exactly the same thing again. Once again, the only difference is that here the first request is for HTTP GET, and this request is for HTTP PUT. So the route is exactly the same, but based on the verb, on the HTTP verb, we have different implementations. On GET, we just get a resource, and on update, we delete a resource. So, on update, we update, of course, a resource, we don't delete it. Good. Now, the very, very basic logic for update is that we also need an updated version of the object. So that version would, once again, similarly to what we have here in the post, come in the body. So we would say once again, here we would have in this case 2 incoming parameters. So we would have once again from body, let's call this updated, because this would be the updated version of a hotel, and then we also need the ID. So in this case, what we would need to do here is specify int ID. So in this case, we say that we have 2 params, and once again, since this is a controller action, ASP.NET Core will take care about providing us values for that. For this one, it will look into the body, and for this one, it will look here into our route, where we have this placeholder for ID. And in this case, we can just here say var hotels. Now, right now, this would be a very, very basic and not interesting at all implementation. But once we go into the database, we'll take into consideration, okay, how can we really update a certain object? But in our case, we will just replace them. So what we'll say here, we'll have get hotels. So we will just do a replace. So first of all, we want, we have an old to be hotels, and here we search actually first or default for a hotel with the ID that we have here in the route. So we want a hotel with the hotel ID equals to ID. And once we have it, we just say here hotels dot remove old. And then we would have here hotels.add updated. Updated. Okay, let's make it like that. Okay, cool. And what we can return here, well, actually, usually what happens most of the time, we return no content. So just a response that everything was successful and that the resource was updated, but we actually don't return any type of content. We just return a notification that everything was successful. So in this case, that our response was successful. And once again, in more advanced scenarios, we would have custom response types. But once again, that's something that we'll look into probably when we'll do a course on ASP.NET Core for intermediate or for advanced, and then we will get into best practices about how we actually should factor our responses. But for a lot of APIs, just adhering to the simply returning no content when you have an update is just okay. So it's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. Good. So that would be then our implementation for that. Let's put a breakpoint. Of course, after we do the update, and if we do a get, once again, as for the post, we won't see any changes as well. We would have actually for each request a brand new list of 2 hotels which are exactly the same. But we still can see how this HTTP update or update action actually works in our API. So let's run the application again. And by the way, guys, if you enjoy what I'm doing here, and of course, if you want, you have also the super chat where you can make a donation by buying a sticker or an emoji. So if you feel like if you feel like donating for this channel, you can do that. That would be highly appreciated. I will still continue to make this series even if you don't. So there's really no pressure on that. But if you just want, then that's something that that could be useful in order to also be able to invest more time in creating content for this channel. Okay, so let's go here in this put, and we see once again that we have the same URL as here, but this is with get, this is with put, and based on this different HTTP verb, we can then, of course, or ASP.NET Core does know exactly which method it needs to execute when we make a request. So we know that we have here a hotel with ID 1. So first of all, let's specify the ID here, which would be 1. And here, for the updated values, let's just move away all the rooms. We don't need the rooms here. And we know that the ID should be 1. We'll just specify the 1. And we can consider that everything else is actually an update because the real hotel with ID 1 has other values here. So we can just then try it out and execute. So we see that we are right now here in this method. And we see that in updated, we have the values that we had in our body. And in ID, we have the ID of the hotel that we provided as a value on the URL. And there's, of course, that very basic logic that we do. We get the old hotel, we remove it, and we add the new one. So right now, if we look at this one, I guess, no, I guess this one was updated here is, well, with the hotel ID 1. So we have here an updated version. And yeah, if we continue, we see that the response was a 204. So 204 was no content. It means once again, it was successful. The update was okay, but then of course we don't need to return anything, just the information that the update process was okay. So that's kind of cool. And now, last but not least, let's implement the delete from CRUD, which is actually the last one. So we would have here public I action result. Let's have here delete hotel. And once again, here we would have to, sorry for all the noise outside, that was a very, very noisy motorbike. All the noise cancellation technology in microphones can't really cope with such a noise, so sorry for that. Good. So what we'll have here is, first of all, as we have a delete, this would have to respond to an HTTP delete method. So for an HTTP delete request. And for route, once again, we can just send a delete request to a route that also contains the ID, and that would identify the ID of the resource that we want to delete. And to delete the resource, we actually don't need anything else. It's just the ID that we need. And based on that value, we can know exactly what resource we want to delete. So once again, ASP.NET Core will do all the magic. And as long as we have here a param, which is called ID, and we have this placeholder in curly braces in the URL, which is called ID, ASP.NET Core will provide us with that value. So what we could do here, once again, var hotels equals get hotels. We get the hotels. Then var to delete equals hotels.first or default. And of course here we need to look for the hotel that has the ID that we had in the URL. So it would be, we look for a hotel for which the hotel ID equals ID, and then we can just say hotels.remove, and we just want to remove this one. So that's cool. And then we can just also return no content. So just like before, we just notify the consumer that the delete process completed successfully, but we don't have any content to return. So just the resource that was deleted. We just informed that the deletion was a success. So once again, let's put a breakpoint here. Let's run the application. Okay. Bring it on the other screen. And we see that we have here this delete. So you see that we have here the same route actually 3 times. But one is with get, one is with put, and one is with delete. And as long as we marked our actions with the corresponding HTTP methods, ASP.NET Core will know exactly what action to execute based on the HTTP verb that we use. So if we want to try it out, specify the ID1. And yeah, here we see that we entered here. So we can go step by step. We have the ID, which is 1. ASP.NET Core did that for us. Then we got the hotel that we want to delete, and we remove it from the list, and then we just return no content, and actually that is it. Cool. So yeah, it's success 204 here in this case, because it is with no content. And before we go any further, here in these last 2 methods, we are exactly in the same scenario as in this get by ID. Like, okay, they provide us an ID, but the consumer might provide an ID that actually doesn't exist. So we have actually to take this into consideration. And for instance, if here in this update, if all is null, so if we don't find a hotel in the list with that ID, that means that we can't really update anything. So we say here if old equals null, in this case, we just return not found. Here maybe we can also return a message, no resource with the corresponding ID found. Okay, so if this is null, we already return, so we don't do anything else. If this is not null, of course, then it will not enter into this if, so it will remove, it will add, and it will then return this no content. And similarly, exactly the same we could do here. So a very, very basic if to delete equals null. So in this case, we can just return not found, maybe with the message. No resource with the provided, no resource found with the provided ID. And yeah, that should actually be okay. I have a typo here, of course, and right now everything should be fine. So right now, if we run this once again, and if we go for update and delete, and we provide IDs that actually don't exist in our very basic data source, then I would expect right now to just get that 404 not found error. Okay, so we have tried the get out, so let's try the put. So let's try it out. Let's put here the ID 10. Here we can leave all the information that doesn't really, we don't really care about it right now. So we execute that and we see that 404 not found. No resource with a corresponding ID found. So in this case, we didn't find the resource. If somebody provides us with the wrong ID here, then we can't really update, so we just return a 404 because we didn't find the resource. And exactly the same thing for the ID on the delete. If we execute it, we get once again the response 404 not found, no resource found with the provided ID. So very neat. We have everything in place. So this is really the very basic skeleton or setup for a CRUD controller in ASP.NET Core. So we have this get all, this get by ID, create, we have update, and we have delete. This is, or these are the very basic CRUD operations that you probably will implement in virtually all controllers that you will ever write. So that's kind of cool, I guess. Good. Let's see. Are you still watching here? Because I see the chat was fairly quiet the last couple of minutes. So there is only one other thing that I would like to resolve during this lesson, but I guess I will need a very short break before that. And the thing that I want to resolve is working with this list. So I don't want to actually recreate it every time. So I might really want to extract this in a separate class and have then like an instance of that class that would always provide me with this list that would be the same, for instance, across all the requests that might come. So I would like to externalize this responsibility of handling for now our data source, because this is our data source right now, to a different class. And that would also allow us to introduce a very nice topic in ASP.NET Core, which is services, and which we will talk about a lot more and in depth during the next lesson. So that's what I still want to do. Hi here, thank you very much for joining. Once again, please bear with me. I just need 5 minutes break, and I will be back then, and we'll actually move this responsibility of handling our data source to a different class. So just stay tuned. I will be back very shortly. Okay, I'm back here. Thank you for standing by. So let's go here into this final part where we could refactor a little bit this code that we have right now to move this logic or this responsibility of holding the hotels to a different class. And we'll create here this class right now. That's something that we will get rid of when we will implement the database. But until then, we can actually use this for working with our resources, and we can even then also have like a base point for in-depth discussion about what services are in the next lesson. But now we kind of want to just set things up a little bit. So let's add a new class here directly into our and let's call this class data source. That would be actually our data source. And let's do here the following thing. Let's have a constructor, and we'll also have a property right now. It would be public, and it would hold a list. Sorry, something went very, very wrong with IntelliSense. So it would be a list of our hotel class. So exactly what we have previously. So it's in the domain models, and we'll call this hotels get set. Okay, and we can go here back in this controller, and we can actually take this this entire method that we have here, this private method, and we can just cut it away from here. Of course, this will generate a lot of errors right now because we don't have this method anymore in this controller, but we will solve this as soon as possible. So no worries about that. Let's go back to our data source, and we'll just paste here the method that we have. And the only thing that we will do in this constructor, we will say here hotels equals get hotels. Cool. So right now we have a class, and whenever we create a new instance of this class, it will actually create this list of hotels and will put it in this property. So we might actually use this property to actually work with the hotels that we want to. So that's kind of cool for now. Okay, now let's go to the very, very fancy part, and let's go to the startup.cs. And here in the startup.cs, we have a very, very, very nice method. And in the next lesson, we will talk a lot about this method and what actually these services are and how they actually work. So for now, we will go here and just add the following thing. So we will say here services.add singleton. And here we can specify, for instance, the type of the service that you want to add. And let's add the data source. Cool. So very, very briefly, what this actually does is that it will, right when the application starts up, it will create actually an instance here of this data source. Although we might get into more details about how this actually happens in the next lesson. But for now, let's stick to this type of information. So whenever the application starts up, what ASP.NET Core does, it makes sure that it would create an instance of the data source. And the cool thing is that when ASP.NET Core creates some instances of the classes that we specify here with services add, because there are several other methods to add this type of services, will be available for us to inject directly in the constructor of our controller, for instance. So that's a very, very cool thing, and it's, by the way, called in ASP.NET Core dependency injection, and that's actually an architectural principle. In ASP.NET Core, we have this by default. We have it built into the ASP.NET Core platform. In ASP.NET Framework, we don't have this by default. So usually what happened is that projects were using other third-party libraries that would provide something like dependency injection. But once again, the very cool thing in ASP.NET Core is that we have it by default. And when we say the word services, let's just think about a class. Nothing more, just a simple and very regular class. So once again, what this does, when the application starts up, ASP.NET Core will make sure that it will create an instance of data source. And this means that this instance of data source will be then injectable in our controllers. So we can come back here to our controller and tweak it a little bit. We can say, for instance, that when ASP.NET Core creates a new instance of this controller, I want to also provide me the data source. Okay, so the instance that we have registered in startup.cs. Now, in order to work with it, we have to assign it to something that we have access to in this class. And here's where the use of private fields come in ASP.NET Core. Because we can say here we want to have a private read-only field of type data source. And we'll call it data source. And this is a convention that I would say most of .NET developers use to name the fields with underscore. You would see probably also some developers and tutorials that don't use this underscore, but most of the code that I've ever seen in ASP.NET Core and in .NET in general uses this type of notation for fields. It is not really wrong to use it also this way, but I say I will go for this route where we will use this naming convention that for fields we will use this underscore so that we know that it is a field. And then in the constructor, we can simply take the field and assign to that field whatever here ASP.NET Core will inject in our controller. And that would actually be our data source right now. So we can go here and here in data source, hotels, that would be simple data source, and we have all the hotels in this property. So we have fixed this error. Let's go back here. Once again, what we do here is we don't get the hotels, we just use data source and this property hotels that holds the list, and everything we do, we actually do there in that specific list. Cool. Now for this other one, exactly the same thing. What we would have here is data source dot hotels. That's cool. We are good with that. Then we should do exactly the same change here. Data source dot hotels. We're also fine with this one. And last but not least, we have this one where we fix exactly the same way. We use the data source and then we have these hotels. So right now we don't have any errors anymore. So we can just run the application once again. And this time the behavior will be totally different. Let's wait for it to open and let's bring it here. Okay. So first of all, let's see that the get for all hotels is still working. So when we click get, we get these two hotels because that's exactly what we wanted to get. So this one is still working. Then get by ID, or this is the post. Yeah, let's create a new hotel. So try it out. Let's provide here the ID of 3, and then here a name, my new hotel. Let's provide here a number of stars. Let's give it 4. Oh, sorry, that's not what I wanted. Let's give it 4. Then address, an address. City, new city, country, new country. Then let's don't care about the rooms right now. We'll come back to this later. And the description, nice description. So we want to create a new resource right now. So if we execute it, we see that we received the 201 created, and that this one was created, and we also get the location header, and we can try it out right now basically in our Swagger. If we go to the next one, get hotels by ID, and if we use the ID 3, and notice that in this case we already have this hotel. So right now, because we moved this this entire data source from outside the controller to our data source class that we have registered as a service actually in ASP.NET Core, we have access to it throughout or outside the boundary of each request. So what we do in one request, we can see replicated here in our data source. So very, very similar to what we kind of will have when we will also persist this in the database. Okay, cool. Let's try to update this right now. And I will just copy here the response that we got here, because I will use this as a JSON body here. So we want to update right out. We want to update the hotel with ID 3. So let's just paste here what we have and my updated hotel. That's actually the only change that we will do. Execute. 204 no content, so it means that it was actually successful. So let's try it out. If we get by ID this one, once again execute, you see that it's my updated hotel. So we have successfully updated this specific hotel. And then we still need to check the delete. And once again try it out. ID 3, execute. 204, so it was deleted. So if we go back to the get by ID, right now I would expect to get a not found because that hotel is not here anymore, and indeed we did get a not found, which is fairly nice. So right now we can say that we have in our very basic or a very new API, we have an endpoint where we have implemented all the CRUD operations, like create, read, update, and delete, and everything happens with a data source that's actually consistent across different requests, so we can simply add everything to our list and then create new instances, update instances of resources, and even delete them, which is kind of very cool. And that's mostly also it for what I wanted to cover today. But and before we really call it a day, once again, that short reminder that if you look in the chat or under the chat, you have there some buttons like the super chat and the custom emojis. And if you want to contribute and help this channel going forward, you can make a donation by simply buying a custom emoji or a sticker, and of course you can just choose what value you would like, and that would really be appreciated. So yeah, that's kind of it for today. So just to set up the stage for the next lesson, which will be next Monday around the same hour, where we will actually go and talk more in depth about what this actually means here, this add singleton, and what services are, what the service lifetime is in ASP.NET Core, how service lifetimes could affect maybe the behavior of our application, and how, for instance, having or working with different services of different lifetimes could even lead us to errors in our application. So next time what we'll do, we'll actually go in depth into what we can configure here in this method, and then we will have a very good understanding about a very important part of ASP.NET Core, which is the concept of dependency injection. And we'll also start by really trying to illustrate and understand in very simple words and example what actually dependency injection is and why we actually need that. So that's kind of what we would cover next Monday. So make sure to subscribe to this channel if you didn't do this already, set reminders, and then be here for the next lesson when we will talk about services in ASP.NET Core. Well, till then, thank you very much for watching. I hope it was instructive for you. If you have any feedback, then just feel free to leave comments to this video and just get in touch with me. But until the next time, next Monday, once again, thank you very much, and I wish you the very best. Take care.